We're very honored today to have Senator Johnson, who will give us some opening remarks in just a moment about this wonderful new Critical Infrastructure Protection Act and other things that he may want to care about, to talk to us about. But I want to take a moment to introduce the person who will introduce him. As you know, we're here at the Dupont Summit. And the Dupont Summit is organized by all those organizations that are basically universities with public policy departments, the Policy Studies Organization. And one of the big sponsors of this group is the American Public University System. And Dr. Boston has been a key leader in this organization. He not only brought them through the process of accreditation, they now have well over 100,000 students. They're one of the premier online organizations in the world. We're working with their library folks to make certain that we can synchronize the for official use only library that InfraGuard members who are cleared by the FBI can use, and all the Homeland Security kinds of things that they offer, along with the Naval Postgraduate College. So we're very honored to have him here today to give the introduction to Senator Johnson. And I'd like to introduce to you someone we're very enthused to be connected with through the DuPont Summit, Dr. Wallace Boston.
Thank you very much. I'm sure that we'd like to hear our speaker more than me, so I'll try to be brief with my biography. Senator Ron Johnson's been a hard worker all of his life. As a boy, he mowed lawns, shoveled snow, delivered papers, and even caddied for a few extra dollars. At the age of 15, he took his first job where he paid money into Social Security and as a dishwasher in a Walgreens grill, later moving up to the job as night manager before he was 16. He gained early acceptance into the University of Minnesota, skipping his senior year of high school, and worked full-time while obtaining a degree in business and accounting. You can see where this is going. After graduation, he worked as an accountant and earned his MBA at night. He's a highly successful entrepreneur and business leader. He brings a wealth of experience and private sector perspective to the Senate. He's fairly critical of the expanding size, scope, and cost of government regulation. The Senator serves on the committees on Budget, Commerce, Science and Transportation, Foreign Relations, Homeland Security and Government Affairs, Small Business and Entrepreneurship. He lives in Oshkosh, Wisconsin with his wife Jane. They have 3 children. We are immensely proud that he's taken time from all of his activities to open the conference. Please welcome Senator Ron Johnson.
Well, thank you, Wally. Thank you, Chuck. Thank all of you for being involved. I think this is a relatively important issue here. This is also a relatively intimidating crowd to be speaking in front of. I'll tell you what I'm not. I'm not an engineer. I'm not anywhere near as smart as you guys. I mean, you guys are the smartest people in the room here. I'm an accountant. I'm a business guy. So what I want to bring to this discussion is how do you solve a problem, kind of a businessman's perspective, because I've been in accounting, but what I've primarily been is a manufacturer for 31 years. And being in manufacturing, you're always solving problems, and there's an organized approach to solving a problem. It generally starts, by the way, with admitting you have one, which is kind of a big deal, and then properly defining it. And I'd like to use a couple examples in terms of government, in terms of why it's so difficult to solve some of these problems. One thing I do try and do, and I'm talking to crowds, especially as a business person, talking to business people, to try and get them to understand in some way, shape, or form the dysfunction that is the federal government, is convey the differences between the business world and government, but also to convey the similarities. And here's one thing that the private sector and the public sector have in common. They're motivated by the same factor. They both want to grow. The difference in the private sector is in order to grow, you have to succeed at something. You have to actually produce a successful product, a successful service. That's how you grow. In the public sector, let's face it, failure allows you to grow. Now, I make that point because I'll come back to it because I think it's crucial in terms of why we don't grapple with some of these problems and why we address others. So, my first understanding of EMP really dates back a long time. I heard about this, some nuclear blast, it could be catastrophic, yeah, but what's the likelihood of that? I first really became aware of it a few months ago when a gentleman named Bob Faltzgraff and Hank Cooper visited my office and presented me a little book, which I started to read, and I didn't really like reading it. and I got a little concerned. And so that really began my journey here. But the reason I came to Washington, D.C. was to address some other problems. And I want to talk about those other problems to put in context what it is we need to do to start addressing this problem. Now, I ran for office because Washington passed Obamacare, which is basically a government takeover of our healthcare system, which I think is going to do a great deal of harm to our healthcare system. I think it's an assault on our freedom. I mean, that was the number one issue, but then along the way, too, I was a little concerned about the fact that we're mortgaging our children's future. Now, I'm an accountant. As I've gotten here, I've really tried to delve into the full extent of the problem. I just want to ask a question here. Anybody in the room here know what our 30-year projected deficit is? Ever heard of it? There's a reason why you've never heard of it, because nobody wants to tell you what it is. CBO actually does project these things, but they don't put it in dollar terms where you can actually understand it. Some people talk about, the unfunded liabilities, it's net present value back over 75. Nobody can understand that. Nobody can relate to it. So in my dealings with the White House, I was one of the small group of about 8 Republican senators trying to work with the White House, trying to find some common ground, at least take the right steps in solving the problem. I came up with the concept that we really ought to look and define the problem properly. Because let's face it, talking about a problem-solving process, America has not collectively admitted we have this enormous debt and deficit issue. They talk, yeah, it's unsustainable, but nobody can really define it, and we haven't properly defined it. We don't have a 10-year budget window problem. We have a 30-year demographic problem. All the baby boom generation, we're retiring at the rate of 10,000 people per day. We've promised all these benefits, because that's an easy thing to do. We don't have any way to pay for it. So anyway, CBO actually projects these things out. They don't do it in dollars. They do it as a percentage of GDP. Nobody really understands that. So we converted those projections into dollars. Let me give you the bad news. Their baseline shows that, or projects that our deficit over the next 30 years would be $66 trillion. Their alternate fiscal scenario is $127 trillion. Now, when you annualize that, when you analyze it, when you take a look at really what's been our 20-year average spending history in defense, all of the programs, the entitlement programs, and then interest on the debt, if you really take a look at it, even the alternate fiscal scenario projected spending as a percentage of GDP is under our 20-year averages. So I would argue even the $127 trillion is understating it. But let me tell you how it's coming at us. We're always talking about a 10-year budget window, right? Well, the first 10 years is about $8 trillion in deficit. The next 10 years is about $31 trillion. The third decade is $88 trillion for a whopping total of $127 trillion. And again, that could be understated. Now, let me put that in perspective because, let's face it, trillions of dollars is literally incomprehensible. The entire net private asset base of America is $106 trillion. Now, the fact that not any American, nobody, virtually, it's 0.0000001% of Americans understands that information, is a big reason why we have not forced the federal government, forced elected officials, forced politicians to start grappling with it. Instead, politicians get away with the demagoguery. They get away with the lies. I mean, how many times have you heard politicians from both parties say that Social Security is solvent to the year 2031 or 2033? It's almost universal. It's also a complete lie. I think Wally would agree with me as an accountant. Yeah, we've got a Social Security trust fund that's supposed to be going to keep that solvent for the next 20 years, but the trust fund's a fiction. The trust fund holds U.S. government bonds. Okay, that's an asset to that agency within the federal government, but a U.S. government bond's a liability to the federal government, to the Treasury. You consolidate the books of the federal government, that nets to zero. OMB in their own publication admits that. But in 7 budget committee hearings, 7, I've laid out those OMB, that publication, those words, calling the trust fund a bookkeeping convention, that transaction nets to zero. Only 2 people, CBO Director Elmendorf, Fed Chair Yellen, were honest enough to admit that it has no financial value to the federal government. Treasury Secretary Liu and 5 OMB directors or 4 OMB directors or nominees refuse to admit that truth. As a result, We haven't even begun to address that 30-year problem. Oh, by the way, 30 years? I mean, I see a lot of white hair in the room here. We know that's not a very long time period. My little baby girl just turned 31, and that went by like that. Now, we've got another problem that we talked about all the time, climate change. Now, first of all, let me go on the record. I do not deny climate change. We've had it throughout geologic time. I also don't deny that man has some kind of influence on it. I just don't know to what extent. I also don't know to what extent throwing hundreds of billions of dollars at the problem will it have any effect whatsoever. And yet, we're throwing at least tens of billions of dollars at the program. It's on all the news programs. We're talking about it all the time. We're whipping up all this state of fear. And we're spending tens of billions of dollars to address a problem that I don't know that you can even fix. You know, I come from the state of Wisconsin. 23,000 years ago, my state was covered in about a 5,000 to 6,000 foot thick glacier. You know, I know there were men back then, but there weren't enough men building campfires to cause those glaciers to recede. Something else was happening. You look at the Vostok ice core sample. Over 400-some thousand years, we've had, I think, 4 or 5 cycle change or climate cycles, somewhere in the 15 to 20 degree range. Something else caused that. Now, again, I don't deny the man has some kind of effect. I just don't know what it is. I don't know what effect we can possibly have. We had Bjorn Lomborg, somebody I really respect, a fellow that realized, you know, you have scarce and limited resources in this world. If you want to solve problems, if you want to alleviate suffering, let's take a look at where those scarce resources are best allocated to benefit the most people. I would argue it is not climate change. That's what he argues as well. But for some reason, Americans believe Vice President Al Gore in 2009 when he said in 5 years, because of climate change, the northern ice cap will be melted. Well, it's 2014, and it still exists. When you look at a lot of people that really promote climate change, you know, I don't know I don't have the exact quote, but you know, let's face it, people promote it, say, I don't care what the science is, this is just such a good opportunity for us to gain control over society. That's basically a paraphrase. And that's what gets me to my point. Government will solve a problem when the result of the solution allows it to grow. When it allows politicians, when it allows government officials to gain control over Americans' lives. That's climate change. That's why so many people are all about spending tens of billions of dollars to solve climate change, because it gives them control. You know, solving the entitlement problem, our debt and deficit issue, what does that result in? That results in less government. That results in less control. So now let's take a look at EMP. I am amazed, having come here now, and finally being made aware of this by Dr. Faltzgraff and Ambassador Cooper. This was made public in 2004. In 2008, and that's what this is right here, this is the preface of the report. It's talking about dependence of U.S. society on the electrical power system, its vulnerability to an EMP attack, coupled by the EMP's particular damage mechanisms, creates the possibility of long-term catastrophic consequences. If our power grid is down for 12 months, this predicts 90% of America would perish. I think that's a problem. Now, you know, I've heard a number, you know, I know James Woolsey wrote an article in the Wall Street Journal. I don't know the truth of this. I don't know the exact numbers. You know, supposedly $2 billion would take us a long way toward protecting our infrastructure here. When I read that, the first thing I thought about, okay, this is what known in 2004, 2008. We had the Great Recession. Washington's response was spending, what, $800 billion on a stimulus for what? Shovel-ready infrastructure projects, right? Why didn't we spend $2 billion in 2009 to at least start addressing this? Could it be because solving this problem doesn't increase government's control over our lives? It's a possibility. What we have is a huge challenge on our hands. And what I like about the SIPA bill is it just starts that process. It's not even nearly enough. But in order to solve a problem, let me go back to my first part of my remarks. The first step in solving any problem is raising your hand and admitting you have one. And then you have to properly define it. Now, let me just tell you my little journey here with EMP. It's pretty confusing. I don't know much about it, but I know a whole lot more about it than most Americans. What I'm starting to find out is it is pretty confusing. When I raised the issue with one of my colleagues, I'm not going to identify anybody, the first words out of the person's mouth was, yeah, that's just that's transformer lobby. They just want to sell the government some goods. Well, maybe that's a possibility. So there's going to be all kinds of political pressure back and forth. What I want to use, and this is my dedication, here's my ask, then I'll shut up. It's pretty unusual for somebody who's been serving the United States Senate for 4 years to become a chairman of a committee, much less a pretty crucial committee like Homeland Security, Governmental Affairs. I'm a business guy. I'm a problem solver. I want to utilize that committee to hold hearings, not as show trials, but as really fact-finding missions, to highlight, to describe, to define problems in a very truthful, in a very honest way. So what I need is people's help. What I'm not going to do, what I don't want to do is announce a hearing next week and then all of a sudden call people up and, hey, can you come testify? What I want people thinking about right now is how can we make this case to the American public? How can we do it so we don't do what Al Gore did and make wild predictions that are just simply proven false after 5 years? How do we do this in a very rational way so that the people promoting it aren't accused of having tinfoil hats on? How do we get the science out there when in far too many cases in the past, science has been misused? So what I'm really asking is I need a lot of help. Start thinking about how do we define and describe this problem to the American public? What's the best way in a relatively short time period, because you don't have a whole lot of time in hearings. And you're going to have senators asking you questions. A lot of them will grandstand. I want to design a committee hearing so we really elicit truth and real information, because that is the only way we're going to collectively be able to solve this problem and have politicians, have elected officials bring what they can to bear to actually solve this problem. So that's what we all need help on. And you guys are the experts here. And you guys have to understand the competing political interests here. And you got to understand how the public's going to perceive industry lobbying for this versus that. So it's going to be a very difficult issue to bring up. It's going to be a very difficult issue to really get the public to admit they have the problem and start working toward the real solutions. And what I'm finding out is the solutions are not that easy. They are relatively complex. And Washington does not deal with complexity very well. So with that, I think I'm out of time. I'm happy to take a question or two unless you want to give me the hook.
What are the chances that the SIPA Act will pass the Senate in a rapid fashion? Could you just maybe project?
Well, it's not going to pass in the lame duck. I mean, there's no time for it. Again, get me the information. Let's hold some hearings, and we first have to actually introduce the bill in the Senate, but that's better done in the next Congress anyway. So again, I'm very there's nothing threatening about SIPA Act. Well, I guess the third part threatens industry a little bit. We need to make sure that we calm everybody down. But from my standpoint, SIPA is primarily there to highlight the issue, forcing DHS to take a look at this. And by the way, we had, in our threat assessment hearing, I asked about EMP, asked about it in a secure briefing, and I'll tell you, DHS is not doing much about it. So it would force DHS to start taking a look at that. And again, this is all about getting public awareness of this stuff. So from my standpoint, the first step is holding the hearings. And if we make an impactful case, we should be able to pass that pretty easily. It just flew through the House. Okay.
One more question, Mr. Popik, identify yourself, and then more questions will happen after the FBI folks.
Hi, Tom Popik, Resilient Societies. My group has been involved in the EMP issue for several years now. One question that comes up again and again is the cost factor. I think you indicated that some cost estimates are low, some are higher. One of the things that's been proposed is a level of protection which wouldn't be as complete as for the U.S. strategic forces, but enough to produce strategic deterrence. So in other words, a North Korea or Iran would know that we have enough protection that it would make them think very carefully before engaging in an EMP attack. I wonder if you could comment briefly on the politics of deterrence for
Sure.
EMP.
Yeah, I mean, so you also have GMD, by the way. So you want to take a look at the whole thing as it affects our electrical grid. I mean, you got missile defense. From my standpoint, again, problem solver, what I'd like to see is information. I'd like to have the electrical grid described. I'd like to see, how many of these huge transformers, how long a lead time are these things? Should we be spending the money to have backups? I mean, should we put those things in place, get those things shielded? I mean, I would really like to see a plan. And, it first starts with describing what the electrical grid is in a very organized fashion, and then you just start adding up the costs. I mean, this is level 1. This is kind of base level of what we need to do in terms of protecting ourselves. Here's level 2. Here's level 3. So here's $2 billion. Here's $10 billion. Here's $25 billion. Here's whatever. And we can we'll use the $2 billion option. So again, it's about information. It's something that is not used very much in Washington D.C. We primarily use demagoguery. I'm into real information. That's what I'm asking you folks is develop the information in an understandable, keep it simple. The old KISS principle, okay? And I think that's the best way of addressing this. Thank you very much for your involvement.